those are them. Yes.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, so it's just not what I printed out. Sorry.
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I think we're going to get started here. So just a few introductions and welcoming remarks. My name is Reed Bogert, and I work with the San Mateo Countywide Water Pollution Prevention Program. I'm also the Basmaa project officer for this particular project, which many of you know is the main goal is to develop a building assessment protocol for managing PCBs during building demolition, and then also to provide some additional supporting materials and guidance and tools to help all of the MRP permittees adopt and implement the program by July 1st, 2019. So that's an important thing, and I'm glad that you all came today. The project has come a long way since its beginning, and there's been a lot of good thought and work that went into developing the assessment and the application supplement materials, some supporting documents to help with the CEQA process and so on. But I think the real work is still yet to be done as far as adopting and implementing the programs at the city and county level. And so now it's sort of like we built this thing and now we have to kind of see if it will fly. So that's the next step, and we have, I guess, under 9 months to actually do this. So the message really is to get started now if you haven't already, and the project team is going to gear everyone up to do that. There'll be plenty of time for questions and so on. So feel free to continue that discussion. And then I guess I'll just say that we have a break. We have kind of two portions for the agenda, and we'll cover all of the backgrounds, the work products, and kind of the recommended process moving forward, and there will be a break at 10:45. So I think with that, we'll get started with the slides. Peter, Schultz, Allen, and Stephanie Hughes are on the project team that are going to share the information.
Did you want to?
Yeah, please. Thank you, Reed, for introducing us, and we're going to get started with Stephanie on the first portion.
All right. So, well, let's see. I guess I'll go to the next slide. We've looked at that enough. So we have a few goals for today, and I don't usually. I printed out the notes for Peter and I don't usually. Some of you know me. I'm a college lecturer, and I walk all around the classroom usually and talk in your face and things like that. But today I actually printed out the notes portion as well, and that's because part of the goal of developing this set of slides is also for you to be comfortable with this information if you need to bring it to city council, if you need to talk to building officials, planning officials, contractors, what have you. And we also put some notes so that it's useful for many people. So as we go along, I kind of want to double check our notes as I'm talking to you to make sure that we have the material there. And if you have questions as we go through the material, because there's something maybe you're not clear on, or maybe you think you're clear on for yourself, but maybe wouldn't be clear explaining that to another individual, and you want a little more clarification, ask those kinds of questions as we move along. I think we have a good amount of time for Q&A as we move through our morning. I would like to acknowledge that there are people, good morning, on a webinar somewhere. and so as we do have our Q&A and such, we do have a pair of microphones around, and so if you do have a question, make sure you get the microphone to you before you start asking your question so that people on the webinar can hear us. Some of the initial information is going to be some basics for some of you. You've heard this before, but we want to all be sure we're on the same kind of foundation here as far as why PCBs are a problem. Then we're going to move into what the actual permit requirement is from the board. talk about the high priority building materials, how those were assigned, and then the tools and guidance that Basmaa has created for you, the steps for compliance, and then get some feedback from this training in the event that you or someone else in your team might need to provide some or all of these slides to someone else. What else would you like to potentially see here? What could we make more clear? All right. So as many of you here may know, PCBs are highly stable and have some unique properties, some unique electrical properties and other things. And so they were used for a number of different processes, and this is where you mostly saw them over the years, and they were discontinued from manufacturing in 1979. The use could have continued into 1980 as stock was moved off of the shelf. And so you see paints and caulking and things like that, which is much of what we'll be talking about here. So the issue here is that PCBs, the San Francisco Bay has been deemed impaired due to PCBs. It's been deemed unfishable through the Clean Water Act. And the issue is that PCBs bind to soil, they bind to sediment, and then at the lower levels of the food chain, they pick up the PCBs in that sediment. It moves up the food chain, it bioaccumulates, so it gets higher and higher concentration through the food chain. And we do have people subsistence fishing in San Francisco Bay, and we need to return to a situation where we do feel that the fish are safe for them to eat. So the first health advisory came up in 1994, where it was determined that PCBs in some species of fish in San Francisco Bay were high enough concentrations of PCBs that they were not safe to eat. So under the Clean Water Act, as I said, if a water body is either not fishable, swimmable, then it's considered impaired. And in this case, it's not fishable. And when a water body is impaired, the Clean Water Act requires that the Regional Water Board prepare a TMDL, total maximum daily load, which we put on this slide as a pollution diet for the lay people to kind of like to understand what this wonky word of TMDL means. So the TMDL, as most of you probably know, requires developing plans to reduce the loadings of that pollutant and eventually achieve water quality objectives. The TMDL itself was completed in 2008. That means that was completed by the Water Board in 2008, and that's when implementation of the different aspects was able to begin, basically. Because this is when they identified, next slide, in their TMDL, they looked at all the potential different sources. So looking at this in the mid-2000s, these are all legacy, it's all legacy sources at this point, right? Because we're not utilizing PCBs anymore since 1980. So they looked at all these various legacy sources, and you can see there's quite a diversity. We have, San Francisco Bay is certainly unique compared to other water bodies in the United States that may be impaired with PCBs. We're a different kind of watershed in that it's a bay and an estuary rather than a river that's flowing with PCBs moving out more readily. We also have the dredging for the fishing, for the shipping channels. So very unique situation here. So they looked at all these different sources, including what's coming in from the Central Valley, from those watersheds, atmospheric, any hot spots, municipal or industrial, military hot spots, at the dredging as well. But even with all those other outside sources, it was identified that stormwater was the single largest source. And so the TMDL is asking for stormwater to pull down the loading to San Francisco Bay, so reduce that diet, if you will, by 90%. And as that, some studies were undertaken during this TMDL process, and they identified that building demolition was a major source to the stormwater. The idea is that you've got PCBs on the building materials. Then, as you demolish the building materials, and you have all of that dust going out, it's going to have PCBs attached to those particles, and will move with those particles through the storm drain system and into the water bodies and into the bay. Nonetheless, it's not that stormwater is being picked on, as it were, or that building demolition is being picked on there. The TMDL looked at all these different legacy sources and sought to find reductions and opportunities for all of the different sources. So while we are going to talk about this one for the rest of today, this very last bullet item about managing PCBs and building materials, realize that, and I think this might be helpful when you're talking with building owners, consultants, contractors, for them to understand that we're not just, the regional board didn't just seek out buildings and the PCBs in buildings, that it's part of this larger body of effort that's going on throughout the Bay Area. We've got the hot spots, the dredgers doing their part, monitoring sediments, wastewater treatment operators and municipalities looking for hot spots and working on green infrastructure that would collect stormwater and rather than let it release pollutants right out into the water bodies. So it's part of a bigger picture, and hopefully that will assist in getting that information out to the building contractors. But that does lead us to why we are here today. The provision in the MRP, so that's your municipal regional permit, right? There's 76 cities and counties and other entities that need to be implementing this. And so the effort that we're going to be sharing with you today is how to sort of, the process is kind of standardize some of this for all of you so that there weren't 76 different ways to implement this throughout the Bay Area. So, so this is in part of provision C12, how to deal with the building materials during, or let's say prior to demolition rather than during demolition. So the requirement in your shared permit is to come up with a method for identifying the right kinds of buildings and building materials, and then provide the necessary authority for that. And so we'll walk you through that. It's only applicable to buildings from 1950 to 1980. Okay, January 1st, 1950 to the end of 1980. Again, that gives a little wiggle room, even though it was discontinued in manufacturing in 1979. They were still moving it off of the shelves, so that gives us a little bit of space for that. You can see wood frame buildings and single-family residents are not part of this, and it's also applicable only to complete demolition, and we'll get back to that in a few moments as well. So you can see that the deadline, as Reed mentioned, is July 1st, and the July 1st deadline isn't to begin talking to council about a program. It's ready to, you need to be ready to go at the permit counter by July 1st. So we'll talk about how to get there today. So the entire point of what we're trying to accomplish is when a building is going to be demolished, that There is some time to evaluate the building, bring professionals in who understand what they're looking for, what kind of materials that these PCBs might be in. We've identified the high priority materials. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then monitoring for that, making sure that those high priority materials then are managed appropriately prior to demolition, so that then when the wrecking ball arrives, the particles that were most likely to have the highest concentrations of PCBs aren't escaping out to nearby storm drains, and the dust isn't spreading around. Well, the dust that will be spreading around doesn't include the high concentration of PCBs, so removing them in advance. So this is very analogous to what is already done with asbestos, right? Similar kind of concept. Carmen, did you want to weigh in at all? I'll hand you a microphone. You have to have a microphone.
Hi, I'm Carmen Santos with the Environmental Protection Agency, and we deal with a lot of these issues about building demolition. And one of the things that happens when somebody wants to demolish a building is to look into what materials do we have there that have PCBs. You know, they will know the age of the building, so they will check and evaluate that, take samples, analyze. And for us at EPA, we prefer that anything that has PCBs, not only those 5 priorities that have identified through this Basmaa process, although those are very important and we find them most of the time in these buildings that are demolished. But the point I want to make is that still you would have PCBs in these buildings even after you take out these priority PCB-containing materials. Usually the PCBs will migrate into the concrete. For example, you could have concentrations in this concrete up to 2,000 or more parts per million. So there are ways in which these demolitions can be tailored or designed so that you can eliminate as much as possible, still having PCBs in the materials that will be part of that rubble that is there and which we wouldn't want it to be there. So that's a clarification I wanted to make.
Thank you, Carmen. So the MRP requires the following components. You have to be able to have established municipal authority through an ordinance, a resolution, something like that. CEQA, notice of exemption, some type of application packet for permittees, those that want to complete a demolition, a methodology for how they survey the building, potential cost recovery, training processes, and then submittal of information to Basmaa, and so that they can, or your countywide program. And what we hope to show you today, if you haven't already seen it in previous meetings that we've had with some of you, is that Basmaa has developed some model documents. They've taken care of the CEQA analysis for you. They've prepared application packages and all these different pieces so that it should be, we're hoping it's fairly straightforward for each of the municipalities and agencies involved. So, as Carmen mentioned, the team came up with 5 high priority containing building materials, so we'll talk about that. And we developed a protocol for you and for the contractors and the regulatory process. And it's worth noting, as it says in the corner there, that we did work with a technical advisory group, and you can see the representatives that were there. So it has been vetted by regulators, industry stakeholders, and municipalities. Sorry. Ooh, didn't know we had a... So there's 3 key definitions. I'll just go ahead and put them all up there. So we had a little bit of haggling back and forth early in this process of what does demolition mean, and contractors explained to us this, that there already is a definition in their field. So it's basically the complete demolition of a building. So we're not talking about a partial demolition of a structure. I'll show you the 5 building materials in more detail in a moment, but we'll hear them over and over again. So really what we're talking about isn't that it's in all possible pieces of concrete, as Carmen alluded to, but caulking, insulation, gaskets, and other adhesives. And then, as I said before, it's any of the structures built or remodeled between 1950, so built or remodeled. So if it was built in the 30s, but a significant remodel perhaps in the 70s, then you're going to need to take a look at it, or the contractor will need to take a look at it, with those exemptions that we mentioned before. So just briefly on background, how did we get to the 5 high priority materials that you're going to be seeing? It was based on a very significant literature review, and where they looked at PCBs, concentrations in a number of building materials, and focused on materials that were most likely to get into stormwater during a demolition kind of sequence. And there were some weighting factors and a whole analysis. If there's questions on that, we're happy to answer those during Q&A. So it came down to caulks and sealants, those that are around windows or window frames, around door frames, expansion joints between concrete sections, so say floor segments that have a expansion joint in between them, thermal fiberglass insulation around HVAC systems, around heaters, around boilers, heated transfer piping, inside walls or crawl spaces. Adhesive and mastic, it could be below the carpet and the floor tiles, or between the roofing materials and the flashing. And the rubber window seals or gaskets around any windows or window frames. You notice a disclaimer here that this does not include things that are typically already managed with pre-demolition activities with current management strategies. So fluorescent light ballast and polyurethane foam furniture and things like that that already would have been removed per current regulations prior to demolition. All right, Peter, I think it's your turn.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. I'm going to handle the next section of the presentation, which is on legal authority, and we'll get into the applicant package after the break. But we thought that it's important to start off this morning and talking more about what you all are going to need to do, because that's the deadline is approaching soon, and so we want to make sure that you are starting to think about, hopefully you've already started in your jurisdiction talking with some of the other people that are going to be involved. And so there's this concept of legal authority establishing, and there are different options that we've laid out. We have a memo, one of the Basmaa documents that's been mentioned. I also, before we go any further, I wanted just to see, kind of hear who's here in the room today. We have maybe different types of departments from municipal organizations that are here. So how many people here are from a building department? Raise your hand. Okay, maybe about 10 or 15 people. Okay, what about a planning department? Okay, just one person. All right, good. Maybe some more planners will be involved later. I'll talk about that. What about building inspectors specifically? Building inspectors. Okay, we got a couple of those. What about people in public works like engineers? Okay, we've got a few, 5 or 6 of those. What about stormwater program managers? Okay, we've got about a good number of those, 10 or 15 of those. Other people that I'm not thinking of? Any other categories?
Stormwater staff that's going to be implementing it.
Right, stormwater staff. Yeah, I was kind of thinking of that program manager kind of people. Anybody else here from another kind of department? Excuse me? Plans examiner. Okay, so plan check, right, and plans examiner. What about permit counter staff? Anybody from that? Okay, we've got a few people there. Okay, good. So you're going to be on the front lines dealing with property owners who come in and maybe are unfamiliar with this issue. All right, good. So we're going to talk. We'll go ahead to the next slide here. Okay, so the municipal role in the process is, as we talked about, you need to establish some kind of legal authority. You need to notify applicants when they're coming into the permit counter, or hopefully even before that, about the new PCB requirements. Reviewing the applicant submittals, and the next presentation is going to go through that whole process. We have some model documents for the application packet or applicant packet, and you'll need to work with them if there's any corrections that need to be done, that kind of thing, making sure that it's filled out correctly and signed and certified. And then at the end, submitting copies of those forms and data to the countywide program in your area and or to Basmaa for the compiling and processing and reporting to the regional board. So in establishing legal authority, there's a few steps you should go through. You want to review your existing municipal codes, and we have some examples of this later on. There's a typical kind of stormwater ordinance that probably most people are going to be looking at. You may also have demolition permit requirements in your municipal code that you may want to look at. And we want you to, as soon as possible, review these with your county council or city attorney, and that's kind of the first step, is to decide if your stormwater ordinance or other ordinance that you're going to use is sufficient, or if you think you need to make some modifications to that. I'll show you an example later today of a kind of a typical section of a code, but we think that a lot of people may make the decision that your existing stormwater ordinance is sufficient, and it does say that non-stormwater discharges are prohibited. So it's pretty broad, but you may want to be more specific to this particular issue, and you may want to add that to your municipal code. Oh yeah, actually, I'm sorry. Here's the section, typical discharge of pollutants, non-stormwater discharges is prohibited. So that's in the model ordinance that was used 10, 20 years ago that I think everybody adopted. This section should be in there. So you should have that already. So there's a few options that we've laid out in the model and the memo that was developed by Basmaa. There's this ordinance option that I just talked about if you need to make some changes to your ordinance. There's a resolution option if you feel that your existing ordinance is sufficient. Maybe you just want to do a resolution and have your governing body decide that they're going to establish this new program, and you could still have kind of a public hearing related to that, and that's a good step for doing outreach to the public, is to have this item on your council agenda or your county board of supervisors agenda, and that resolution option would set out some background information and authority to give to staff to develop a program. So that's the summary of the resolution option. It might also define in more detail some of the implementation mechanisms that you're going to use, such as changing conditions of approval. You might want to have a new standard condition of approval that relates to this requirement, or you could modify an existing condition of approval. You could have some other details in that resolution, and we have a model staff report and resolution that you can use as well in the Basmaa documents. You might want to be modifying your demolition permit requirements or your construction and demolition recycling regulations. So those are all some things that could be mentioned in the resolution or in the staff report that goes with it. And then the third option is probably the one that's the fastest to get done. You may decide that, well, if your current ordinance is already giving you the authority. Maybe you could have an information item to the council, or just inform them. The city manager or the county executive could decide that they're going to just go ahead and do this without having to do a whole big process, either through ordinance or council process, and you could just do a management kind of decision to change those conditions of approval or your other permitting regulations and processes. So that would probably be the fastest option, and if you run out of time for some reason, you might want to consider that option as well. Let's see if there's anything else. Yes, and you could also direct other staff to collect the data that's required and follow all the regulations required in the permit. Any questions on any of that before we move on? Yeah. Let me make sure we get the microphone for all the questions.
So would you anticipate, since this is such a regional effort, that there is going to be significant pushback from the industry that would require maybe a more formal ordinance route to defend the municipality, or do you have any kind of feeling on that?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that is one argument for doing a more robust process to make sure that property owners can't come and say, oh, well, who decided this? If you had your city council or your county board of supervisors making the decision through a public process of some kind, then I think that helps give some backup to that argument that this was decided at a public meeting and it was through a resolution or an adoption of an ordinance or a modification of an ordinance. If it's just a management option without any kind of public noticing or like that, maybe that's a little bit less. But it depends on your community and how many buildings are we talking about. It may only be 1 or 2 per year in your jurisdiction if you have a smaller jurisdiction that doesn't have a lot of new development or doesn't have a lot of these types of buildings that we're talking about, which are concrete, mostly probably 1-story in old industrial buildings. So it's going to vary by your jurisdiction, I think. But yeah, if the safer approach would probably be to do a little bit more of a public process. Does that answer your question? We haven't heard from property owners really yet, I don't think. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but that part of the outreach, I don't think we've accomplished yet. So we'll have to see. Sherry, did you have a comment?
Do you think it's likely that some cities will be more detailed in their implementation process? So perhaps going from city to city, one contractor, or is there no wiggle room? Maybe a contractor says, well, Fremont didn't make me do that, or Cupertino is making me do too much, or I'm just wondering, are we all going to be exactly, or closely?
Well, that's why we developed these model documents. We have this applicant package. I think we want everybody to use the applicant package that we've developed, or you can make some tweaks to it, but you may have to make sure that it still meets all the minimum requirements, especially the certification part of it is key, that they have to certify in any applicant pack. Because some people have talked about, oh, let's reduce this down to just like those screening questions and add it to our building permit. So we'll talk about that later, but I think there are some minimum things we want to, and maybe when Stephanie gets to the applicant package, she can address some of that.
Let's revisit that question and maybe get some feedback from the audience here when we go through the applicant package and what we're, the model that we prepared for you, and get feedback of if people plan to use it as presented.
I have heard some jurisdictions saying they want to start early. There's no reason to wait until July 1st. You can start earlier, and it might be better to start early in your jurisdiction for various reasons. Yeah.
So what option that the local jurisdiction choose, does it need to be reported back to any organization?
That's a good question. What you mean, kind of what you decided in the end of what you're going to do? We don't have a requirement for that, I don't think. It might be in your annual report how you decided to implement this, your annual stormwater report to the Regional Water Board. I would think we'll have questions in next year's report that's due September 30th of next year. There'll probably be questions related to this, how you implemented the requirement, what did you actually do? I'm sure we'll have questions like that. So you'll be reporting it to the Regional Board, but not necessarily back to Basmaa. Okay, any other questions? Okay, then we'll move on. So I think we've handled this slide. Oh, I do have, maybe it's on the next one. Okay, so of course we want you to start communications early. If you haven't done it yet, I would make an appointment with your city attorney or county council to go over your current or existing ordinance and other policies and procedures you have in place right now. Because, as a lot of you know, sometimes it can take a little while to get on that person's calendar and set up that meeting. And that's really the first step is, make the kind of presentation to that person to say, here's this new requirement, how are we going to deal with it in our jurisdiction? And I would get on that right away. And then there are other departments, of course, too, that you want to work with, the planning department, the building department, public works, anybody who's involved with permitting of building demolitions or the stormwater program, the C&D recycling programs, construction demolition waste recycling programs. These responsibilities can be spread out through various departments. So start talking with all of them. And we do have later on, we'll have a model timeline, an example timeline to show how much time does it take? And of course, the ordinance option is going to take the longest. So if you think you're going to need to go that route, you need to get started. You should have already started probably by now, depending on the size of your jurisdiction. The larger jurisdictions usually need more time. So, then, of course, initiating the legal authority actions with, as I mentioned, with the management staff, attorney, your governing body, obtaining approval from the governing body or the county board of supervisors in time, and that can take a few months. So start thinking about that. Okay, and as we've mentioned before, Basmaa has developed a lot of model documents to make this process as easy as possible and as consistent around the Bay Area as possible with these 76 permittees. There's this mechanism to establish municipal authority. And these are the different components, and then the materials we've developed. We have a model ordinance, a resolution, staff report. There's the CEQA notice of exemption, and we've created a model notice of exemption for CEQA. There's the application package that we're going to go through, and we have the model package for that. A building survey protocol, and there's an appendix of the applicant package that talks about how to survey the buildings. We talked about a cost recovery mechanism. You may want to have an additional fee added to your demolition permit process to cover your staff time for reviewing this new application package, or maybe there's a deposit or something else you could do to help with that cost recovery. And we have a document that goes through that, and we think that this application package is pretty straightforward. It shouldn't take too much time to review, maybe only an hour or two. So staff time could be limited to $400, something in that range. We tried to come up with some kind of number based on an hourly rate for staff review. There's you're going to need to have a process to train relevant staff, and that's why we're doing this presentation today. We've got another presentation coming up, and then you may have additional trainings either through your countywide program, or maybe some of you today might go back to your jurisdictions and they can watch this webinar, or you can give the presentation yourself. We're going to make this PowerPoint presentation available to anybody who wants to use it to train staff. We're going to have one more training at the end of this month. And so for those people, and it's probably going to be more of the countywide program staff and maybe some of the consultants who will go to this this additional training to kind of train the trainer training. But we want to get feedback today if things are not clear in this presentation, so that we can make the changes to that. The last one on here, a process to submit the completed data forms to Basmaa and or the countywide program. We don't yet have that done, but that's to be considered in the future, and we'll be talking with Basmaa and the various countywide programs to figure out the best mechanism for that. it may be incorporated into other processes that happen at the end of the year. Okay, so here's kind of an overview of the implementation process. You're going to establish your building authority, your legal authority, and your legal mechanisms, notify the applicants, maybe make changes to the documents that you already have or create some new documents, and make sure that you understand the process. There's kind of these two thresholds, but it also gets a lot more complicated if EPA starts to get involved, and we're not going to try to turn all of you into EPA experts because it's a very complicated process, and your process, your part of it is really maybe a very small portion really, but it's a key portion, is to get these particular types of buildings that meet these different thresholds to start to test if needed. So that's really only, that's one of the main parts that the municipal staff need to do, is just to include that additional part of it. And so there's these applicable structures and non-applicable structures. The applicant needs to do some screening. There's this level of 50 parts per million, but there are other thresholds as well. And so then the applicant will go through that process, and they'll submit a self-certified form to the municipality, either stating that no further requirements are needed, or there are no further requirements, or that they will be doing testing and they're submitting the test results, and that they'll do the applicable remediation for that. So the applicant's role in the process is to do their due diligence, complete and submit the assessment forms, either being screened in or screened out, with the types of questions that we're going to be talking about, and then the testing if needed, and then demolition, and they'll be doing their remediation just as they would do for asbestos and lead, and if they have to do that remediation, they will do that. And the ones that are screened out will not have to do that additional steps. We have a question over there, Stephanie. If you could bring the microphone over there.
Question on the application form. Instead of, is it possible to, instead of including the non-applicable buildings so that we have all those forms, to just have statements in there that omit them, so that the only forms that are completed are those that are applicable to it, to kind of reduce the paper load?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're going to go through the whole applicant package in a minute, but I think what you're saying is, can you just put the screening questions into some other document and then screen out them that way?
In particular, 1A, it says, are you a building from...
Yeah, the years.
The years.
Yeah.
So what if the form just said applicable to buildings within, so that a person who's coming in for a demo application, who's working on a building that's say 1985, they don't have to touch that form, and it's one less person, one less paper trail to follow and certify.
Right,
so it only applies to those folks that are working on those buildings within that criteria.
Right. So are you saying that you want to use the applicant, the package as it is, but have like these kind of off-ramps early on in it? Or are you saying to take some part of the applicant of that package and put it into another document?
Use it as it is.
Okay.
But if I'm coming in to apply for a demolition permit, and my building is 1985,
right,
I look at that form and I don't have to touch it because my building doesn't apply to my building. So
I think, and we'll go into this in more detail, I think the problem is that they need to certify that. So they have to fill out the form, check that box, and say what year it was built, and then skip right to the end and certify that that's the case. And so I think it could be pretty quick. But other people have asked if there's a way to take those screening questions out and put them into some other document. And I think that that's okay as long as they certify it, and we have this certification process that, or section of the form that would also need to go to that other document. So let's talk about that in the next section under the application package, because maybe there are some options there. But that's the key issue, is if we have these, like I think it's 3 screening questions, but we also have to make sure they certify that that's true. You can't just have them say, oh yeah, it's 85 and not do anything more, because someone's got to prove that or state that, with legal kind of backup to it to say that they certify that's the case. Okay, so we're going to move on. Actually this next slide talks a little bit, hopefully you can see this, maybe the print's kind of small, but do we have it? Yeah, so there's this first step here. This laser pointer's not very good, but the first step is the building wood framed or single family residential? And if that's yes, then you're going to be then you're exempt from the process. And if it's no, then you're going to ask more questions. Was it constructed during those years, 1950 to 1980, or remodeled? And if it's yes, then you keep going down through the 3 different questions. And if you answer yes to all those, then you're going to have to do more detailed analysis of the building. But if you can answer, if you can get out of those questions either by saying yes, it is a wood frame or single family, or wood framed or single family structure, then you get exempt. Or if it's no to the other 2 questions, then you also can be exempt. So we're going to go into more detailed description of this in the next section.
I just want to mention that this is in the applicant package to help the potential applicants understand what all the off-ramps are. So they'll see this flow chart in the package.
Okay, and then just finally, I think this is the last slide of this section. We just wanted to show you these 2 different documents that were created by Basmaa through the regional project. One is the model screening applicant package that we're going to talk about next, and one is the protocol for evaluating the priority PCBs-containing materials before building demolition. And when we say before demolition, it could happen as part of the demolition process, so it's kind of maybe a wordsmithing there, but in my mind, doing the remediation is part of the demolition. You're going to be removing parts of the building. So in other people's minds, that's something you do first before you demolish the whole building, is you take out the various sections. So I guess that's kind of just a way of there are different ways of understanding that wording. But anyway, you have to make sure that before the building is sent off to the various recyclers or landfills that you've done the due diligence and done the process correctly. So those are both documents that were created by Basmaa and are available for people to use. Okay, so now we have some time for Q&A before we go to a break. And just if there's any other questions, maybe we've already answered the questions that people had, but if there's a few more, we can, over here.
And also if people have begun to have a conversation within their municipalities, if you have thoughts or feedback you want to share with other agencies.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, and they're definition related. First is, can you talk a little bit about what certification means or looks like? And then second, what does representative sampling mean when you've got a large building?
So when you say what does certification look like, you mean in the applicant form?
Right. I know it's self-certification, correct?
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we're going to talk about that, I think, in the next section. We'll get to that. We're going to go through each part of the applicant package, and so part of it, there'll be a slide on the certification form itself. So we'll talk about that then. What was the other question?
Kind of the same definition. It's what's representative sampling mean when you've got a large warehouse, a shopping mall?
Yeah. I think that's covered in the protocol in great detail. So I'm not sure how much time we want to spend on that here, but maybe Stephanie will. Yeah, there's a slide on that. So I think that's coming up after the break. Any other? Yeah, we have another question over there.
Sherry, did you?
I guess this is kind of a question for the audience, and it's probably not a broad enough audience, but in Cupertino, they're starting to demolish a mall, and this is all we're gonna be well into it by July 1st. Mm-hmm. And I would like to implement early, mm-hmm. but I don't know what ground we have to stand on to implement it early. Mm-hmm. I mean, do other cities have ideas? Or, does anybody know how you could present that to your governing body or to your city manager about why it's important to implement early? And then, of course, I imagine this is going to be very expensive for the developer to implement this. So.
Well, my first thought is that the permit says you must implement by this date. It doesn't say on that date. It says by that date. So I think you have authority under the permit to start even today. Whether or not someone could say, hey, why are you doing this early? You have extra time. Why are you, so people could make arguments that you shouldn't start early. Other people could say start earlier the better because, you're prohibiting these discharges of a pollutant to the bay that's already impaired. So I think you have legal authority to do it now.
And you have only that one big mall.
Yeah. So I think someone could make the environmental argument that the sooner the better. And that's why the permit has these requirements in it.
This may be a question for the EPA, but earlier you mentioned that you didn't want to make us all EPA experts on PCBs. What type of infrastructure is going so that when the person at the window or the person applying talks to the counter person, who do they point them to? Numbers, websites? Is there going to be adequate infrastructure so that our customer doesn't feel like they're just being pushed off to some anonymous web page that really doesn't satisfy that interaction they need to ensure they follow the proper methodology for screening, and then in case of disposal, that's handled in a way that meets the EPA standards and all the potential cradle-to-grave issues that go along with that.
I'll let Carmen, I think, answer the bulk of that question, but just in preface, I'll say that we are working, Basmaa is working with EPA and the regional board staff to try to streamline the process as much as possible and get information summarized in we'll summarize the regulations that will be easier to understand than maybe it currently is. So we're working already on that issue already, but I think Carmen can give you some more information on that.
Okay, so you can call our office. I mean, whoever has questions that pertain to disposal, for example, of waste that may be coming from these demolished buildings, they can call our office. We have PCB coordinators in all our 10 regions. So the website, EPA website, identify the people and the phone number. So for my region, I am the PCB coordinator. They can call me, 415-972-3360. Now, I wanted to clarify also that in our process, we have a broader thing. With Basmaa, they're doing the best they can with the highest priority PCB-containing materials. We deal with those too, but more than those materials. And we also deal with materials that have been contaminated by those that are PCB-containing or manufactured that way. So we would like to prevent certain things, just like Basmaa is also trying to prevent stormwater runoff that contains PCBs going to the bay. We are also trying to prevent that. That's why we believe it's very important to know how to segregate the waste from this building even before it's demolished. So that's one aspect of that. In doing so, there will be waste that for their disposal, you would need a notification to EPA. So it could potentially be unavoidable to have to notify EPA about the waste that is being generated, whether it is less than 50 parts per million or 50 parts per million and above that. So it's a process where we will all have to work together to make it work and for it to meet the goals that it's supposed to meet of the, protecting the bay.
Hold on a second.
So I'm thinking in terms of the counterperson having outreach material that has that website, has a central number for our, say, for Santa Clara County that they can reach, so it's not specifically to you in case you go on to another role. It's something that we can print out, hand to someone, and we know that's going to be an active number that will generate a response that could serve our customer.
Right. We don't have something like a hotline like that, but something for us to think about. So
and there is disclaimer information in the package and in the application, so that the counter staff should be able to refer them to that. So we also have a fact sheet that we've developed for industry, and we have a fact sheet for municipal audiences, so we might be able to add some information to one of those fact sheets. That's part of what we're, I think, also getting feedback on as well. Pam.
Carmen, this question's for you. I'm wondering, once the EPA is notified, and in this case, I guess it would be you, how long do you think the turnaround would be for the applicant to receive communication from the EPA and for whatever process that needs to happen for that to be completed, so that at the local government level, the demolition permit can be given out to the applicant and the project can continue?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, because you're going to be having your own process by which you have to issue some type of permit. I would say that the applicant is responsible for ensuring compliance with all laws, federal, state laws. So if they have PCBs that are in this building, and due to the PCB containing the source materials that are there, like caulking or mastic, whatever, you have contamination to other things like concrete, for example, then they should be notifying EPA that they have this concrete contaminated with PCBs, and what do they do with it? So it's possible by concentration goes to a certain landfill, like a municipal landfill, for example, and they would need to have some type of approval from EPA for that disposal. So in terms of how long does it take, EPA doesn't have a lot of staff to deal with hundreds of demolitions at one time. But we're working on that issue, trying to see how we could deal with it. Could we have some type of more self-implementing approach? So those are things that we're looking into, but it's very early right now, for us too. So for a typical, like say somebody like Kaiser, for example, Kaiser Permanente has been demolishing a lot of their medical facilities. So we get a certain plan from them, a waste segregation plan that includes everything. They includes all their pilot studies, everything. They know where they have the PCBs and where they don't. So it takes us about 45 days to 60 days to approve something like that, but we try to keep it to the 45 days. So some demolitions are more complex than others. Some you have more types of materials, PCB materials or waste that will be generated. Then there is another complicating factor as well, which is recycling. Many, counties want a lot of recycling done on these materials. So we set up the guideline of, say, like 0.24 parts per million PCBs, which is unrestricted level use for concrete, for example. If somebody wants to recycle the concrete, they have to show, okay, we're removing PCBs from, we're cutting, let's say, for example, concrete that contains PCBs above 0.24 parts per million, and that we're going to dispose at the landfill, but the other that is clean, that we believe is clean based on the testings or pilot tests that we have done, we will recycle. So we have to make sure that reuse of something from these buildings that contain PCBs are also consistent with our requirements in the regulations.
Right. So as a follow-up, I'm wondering, if we are focusing on 5 priority materials, we require the applicant to test those materials. If they then have to contact the EPA because of a high concentration, would the EPA require that applicant to do additional sampling, for example, of concrete, like you just mentioned?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because if somebody there is no. You remember the rubble that you saw? What was that? It was one of the slides that was shown when you're demolishing. I mean, it's a big thing of concrete or whatever, all mixed up. We're trying to not have that situation, because you could end having PCB contaminated concrete going to a recycler, and that's not okay. So we're trying to prevent that. So before, what Kaiser, for example, has done with their buildings, they have pretty much done waste segregation before demolition. They have done testing, they have done the pilot studies, they have figured out, okay, this is where we want to cut concrete away from this window and put it all together with the window and get rid of it this way. And this is where we have concrete that is more clean, or maybe stucco that is more clean, whatever. So those is the approach that is taken to demolish something that is very important to prevent more issues. If we don't remove all the materials that have PCBs, even though we're removing those 5, we still have what we call a substrate, like the concrete that is contaminated with PCBs. We still have that available. The dust from that, which should be prevented as well. We require air dust monitoring plans when demolition is happening, and when they are removing also the PCBs. So it's a lot of moving parts that are critical to making the whole process successful to prevent these PCBs going to the bay. We also require stormwater drains and catch basins. We require that they be looked at, and if they have sediments in them, those be tested, and if they have PCBs in those sediments, they be removed.
You mean private ones?
Say, I would put Kaiser again as an example. Kaiser Permanente had a medical building in San Francisco, for example, and they had storm drains very close to that building. So they checked the storm drains. They had PCBs in the storm drains, and they removed them, and they put in best management practices for storm drains, like yellow jackets and other type of things. So that's what is part also of our requirements for a demolition party.
Was the question, Pam, as you framed it, meant to get at, is there anything more that you need to do from a city perspective? Once they've certified for those 5 priority materials, then is your question, is the city good to go to give them a demolition permit, or?
Well, my question is regarding concern that various cities have, that they will receive a lot of negative feedback from applicants if their project is significantly delayed. And it's useful to city staff, especially counter staff, to know what type of delay an applicant may have, and because they will be asking us, they will ask us, how long is the EPA going to take to review this? When is my demo permit going to be approved if I have to do this process, et cetera. And so it's useful for cities to know what the applicant will expect.
All right, so there are things that an applicant can do on their own, like right now, for example. Somebody will look at their building, do an evaluation and say, okay, well, we're going to sample they know. They go ahead and sample mastic, caulk, whatever. Some of them go further than that and sample the concrete, and all that information is available already. So we're not even involved in that sampling at all. All we get is the results of all the sampling that was done, and then the person that wants to demolish says, okay, well, we want to demolish this building and we have this type of waste. So we have what we call PCB remediation waste. Sorry for such a long-winded, answer, but you need to also understand how our regs work a little bit, real fast. So let's say you have caulking applied in that line there, in that concrete there, and so the concrete gets contaminated. We remove the caulking. So the contaminated concrete now is what we call a PCB remediation waste. To dispose of that, EPA should be notified. So that's the point at which the demolition party usually involves EPA. Once they know what they got, what type of waste, where it should, where they're thinking it could be disposed of at, so they write this plan and they send it to EPA. We don't get involved in the initial sampling of all the building materials and the concrete and all those things. We get involved more toward the end of that process where they know what they have. They have identified the different types of waste. They have identified the disposal method for each of those types of waste. And then we know also that we could have dust generated, so there is an air monitoring plan attached to that plan. And then you also have a soils cleanup plan as well, because many of these buildings, you can go 3 feet, 5 feet away, you will see PCBs due to the materials that contain PCBs in that building. So those are, like, in general, the 3 big aspects of what we get involved with. So your applicant wouldn't be delayed by us if you're issuing a permit, because your permit, I believe, is based on all those 5 categories, and they have to sign off on that. So the applicant outside of that process has a responsibility of determining do the EPA regulations apply to this or not. So that's something they need to determine. And if they're not sure, they can call our office.
Yeah, in the back.
So from a building department standpoint, there's a couple factors that I'm looking at. Is they're going to need a permit through the EPA, possibly? No permit from EPA. That's good. Okay. So
no permit.
Yeah, okay. So I'll stop right there. But okay. But we're mandated to ensure that 65% of the materials from a demolition project is recycled. Yeah. Some cities require deposits. Some cities, if you're not demonstrating that, may be getting fined from the state for not demonstrating that. So there's a tracking issue there. The next question is, do we have people that are certified to do the testing? And do we require a certified abatement contractor for that purpose? And then with the fact that it could be airborne through dust, is Bay Area air quality involved in this as well?
So I can, I think, answer the first question. So some jurisdictions have their own local C&D recycling, regulations, and then there's the state through CalGreen. Both of those, my understanding is that anything that's considered hazardous waste is subtracted out from that calculation before you check the percentage of what's recycled. So anything, if they find PCBs and they remove all that, they remediate that, what's left, concrete, metal, all that stuff, then you figure out the 65% based on what's left. So this should not affect, I don't think, that percentage goal. Yeah. CalGreen doesn't exempt hazardous waste? Okay, well, I thought it did, but we can confirm that. That would make sense. I would think that, you can't recycle. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's true. So we should confirm that. And he had a second question, which was about. Yeah, with the dust-related aspects, is the air district involved when it gets to dust?
What are you asking?
Yeah, if do you know, Carmen?
Well, in our agency, we look at the dust from a health perspective. So we do a back calculation of, depending on the volume of the... Well, we usually use PM10 monitoring, but that depends on a calculation that we could do before that, where we decide what level is best to use, PM10 or a more stringent level for the dust.
Hey, Carmen.
I think John Conan here can also say something.
Speak to that a bit. I'm John Conan. I'm the project manager for the consultant team for this project. And we had a technical advisory group that include representatives from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So they heard about all the things that we're planning through this, and they did not say at any point that they would need to step in because of the dust issue. So to the best of our knowledge, they will not be involved. I think that's all I can say right now. We can repeat the question to them just to make sure that it's clear, but they haven't told us they'd want to be involved.
Yeah, but they do have their rules for emissions. It could be fugitive dust. From our agency, we do look at it. We do look at dust from a health perspective because the public may be close, so it's more for protection of the public during when that process is happening.
So part of protecting the public is the contractors required to be licensed.
Yes. So the contractor that is doing that would perform those monitorings. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they are certified. Yeah, and there are certified abatement contractors for this, and there's a list available from the contractors. Is that a new C number? And
There's actually no certification for abatement contractors for PCBs right now. I mean, we have talked to industry groups, and they're putting together lists of contractors that have experience with this kind of work. So we'll have that list, but there's no formal certification the way there is for asbestos, for example. When you send samples to a lab, you do have to use a certified lab for the analysis, but for the contractor itself, there's no certification at this point. Maybe that's something that'll be developed in the long term, but given the time frame we're doing this under, there wasn't time to develop a certification process for abatement contractors.
You want to take maybe one more question, and then we'll go to our break?
One more question, then we'll have a break, and then we'll have time for more Q&A at the end.
Hi, thanks. This is kind of a two-point question. One is, Carmen, for the EPA, is there a standard form for notification so the cities know what to look for when the applicant has said they've notified adequately the EPA?
We don't have a form, but we do have mentioned in our, if they're doing, say, the notification is for PCB remediation waste, that's what the notification would be, meaning by that, you have concrete that is contaminated with PCBs. You may have metal that is contaminated by PCBs that comes from those manufactured products that contain it. Then a notification to dispose of that would be needed. The regulation itself contains the language that contains the information that has to go into a notification. That could be in the form of a letter to EPA that says, we have such and such materials, we want to dispose of them in this manner, and that, it could be something simple as that. It could be more complicated, complex, depending on the situation. But pretty much it's a notification that we do have these materials, we need to dispose of them, and here are the options we're proposing to use for that disposal. So that's pretty much it in this situation. Also, the soils, if there are soils that are there and could potentially be contaminated, then the notification requirement is a little bit more involved.
So the second part of the question is, once a plan or a notification goes to EPA, is there at some point when it's taken up by EPA that you notify back either the applicant or the cities? And what does that look like? Is that also in the form of a letter or notification so that the cities are aware that that's happening?
All right. So if it is the applicant, or what we call it, the cleanup party, if it is one of, this person that wants to do this work, we will respond back within 45 days.
And to the applicant, not to the city.
Applicant. But if the city wants to be copied on that, we will copy you.
Well, we just want to know first, so we can ask the applicant for a copy of that. So
we can copy you directly. Yeah. So it would be what we call, we're approving their notification. So, and we would say is a response to the notification, what we do, or an approval to the notification.
So the city could...
Yeah, yes. That's within the 45 to 60 days.
That's we think, well, depending on which option we're using. We have two different options there. We have a self-implementing option, then we have a risk-based. So if it's self-implementing, it's 30 days. If all the information is there and is accurate and all. But at the most, our goal is to respond to anything like this within 45 days outside of the self-implementing process. Yeah, self-implementing is 30 days. We have to respond within that time frame.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so let's go take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 11:15, and we'll continue then. Thank you.
right, if folks can get back to their seats, thank you. So next we're going to talk about the application package for the applicants. All right, thank you. So the last two agenda items are to discuss the applicant package and then the municipal process with some examples from Peter. So I will provide, oh, no problem. Okay. So I'll speak to the first part and Peter to the second, and then we'll have some last Q&A and head out towards lunchtime. Thank you. So as we went on break, we showed you that there were two different documents. The one on the left is the applicant package, which is what I'm going to talk about next. And then on the right is a protocol for evaluating priority PCB materials. And that responds to the question that was on the Cupertino team over here regarding what level of sampling, so how the frequency of sampling per so many linear feet and things like that. So that's where you would find that. So I'm going to talk about the item on the left, though, the applicant package. So, this provides the overview for them as well as instructions. That flow chart that you saw is actually legible in the applicant package, and then some supporting documents. So what I'm going to walk through is the form, which looks like this. There's 4 parts. I know you can't see any of that, but I'm gonna blow all 4 of those parts up. It's very simple. There's a 4-part form. The first part is just owner information. The second is checking off any of those 3 exempt structures. The third part is the part where they have to really dig in if they're doing some kind of an analysis of the structure. And then the fourth part is certification. So every applicant, this gets to the question earlier, does everybody have to have all of this? The way we've set it up is everybody has to tell you where the building is and who owns it, whether it's exempt, and then certify. So the point being, So even if they screen out, we still want them filling out 1, 2, and 4 to clarify the project, that they're exempt, and that they're certifying. So just owner and project information, that's clear enough. These are those 3 pieces of do they get to screen out of the process. So the wood frame or single family structure, the 1950 to 1980, and then is it a complete demolition? Is the proposed demolition a complete demolition? So they have to fill that out. And then they have to certify, which is part 4, which I wish I had as the next slide. Now, if they don't screen out, but rather screen in, then you have part 3. Let's look at what part 3 says. There's 2 options under part 3. Most likely they're going to use option 1, where they're conducting representative sampling. They're on the left. And there's a series of tables, which I do have in a future slide. There's a set of tables that goes with this. There's a table for each of those 5 priority pollutants, or priority materials, sorry. So they'll have to fill that out. You'll see that there's a QA/QC checklist. So that's likely what they're going to do. It's possible. We've provided an option 2 on the right. It is possible that there would be existing sampling records for that facility, and if so, they could provide that as well, or in lieu of having to do sampling. What is the protocol for the sampling? That is that second document. So that explains those 5 priority materials that we discussed before. It describes the sampling procedures, what kind of equipment, the frequency, It explains the frequency of sampling and QA/QC, and then there's some photos that help them identify the materials. I pulled my laptop up over here to the front table because we also we prepared a second presentation, very, very similar to this one, but one that's tailored more to industry representatives. And on that, we had an additional slide that's not in this that maybe we would like to add to this in the future, because this is to that question that came up earlier as far as minimum sample frequency. And there's a table in this protocol that describes the minimum number of samples, like for the caulking or the rubber window gaskets. It's so many samples per linear foot. So like 3 samples per 50 to 250 feet of caulking, for example. Or if it's mastic that maybe is under some floor tiles, for instance, it's a minimum of 3 samples per 1,000 square foot of the mastic area. So, and then for thermal or fiberglass insulation, it's 1 bulk sample from each homogeneous area. So that is included in this protocol, and we can include a sample slide for this for your future trainings. So these are the reporting tables that go with part 3 of that primary page. So there are 5 different tables, 1 for each of those 5 priority materials. So you can't read it so well, but the first example is the first one at the top is for caulking, and it says pays to see each sample number, the concentration, and the amount of linear feet that represents. So, and then you see another example there for thermal insulation. So there's 3 more of these, 1 for each of those, so that all of those 5 priority materials are, there's places for them to provide their data for each of those separately. And then the last part, which everybody needs to fill in, is that part 4, the certification. And there might be an owner for the property, or it could be a trust with a legal representative. They may have a consultant or a contractor. If so, the form is asking both of those to sign. So the owner or their legal representative for the trust, as well as the consultant. So not just the consultant, but some ownership as well. Wow, I don't know. Round 2 of Carmen and EPA. So this is the language that is in the applicant package, notifying them of existing federal and state PCB regulations. So that it came up during break time that it wasn't obvious to everyone that these EPA regulations have been in place for some long time. This isn't new. That part isn't new, what Carmen's describing. So these entities should be out doing that anyway and reaching out to EPA. So that is not new. And so we list out the various regulations, noting that additional sampling for an abatement of PCBs may be required, and that you may need to seek to notify or advance approval from EPA before demolition. And then there's some notice that additionally the disposal of PCBs waste is subject to California Code of Regulations, Titles 22 as well, regarding hazardous waste. So at that point, that's where we're recommending that the counter staff defer to EPA. I think we kind of had that conversation in part 1 of this morning. Yes? Question?
So, per this language, it would seem that, and given that the EPA doesn't, they're working beyond the 50 ppm concentration that's required under this program. So does this mean that an applicant who has to do the sampling, the representative sampling, if they find any concentration of PCBs, even if it's under 50 parts per million, they should be reaching out to you guys?
Yes.
So basically, any applicant who finds any PCBs should be in touch.
That would be best, yes. Because sometimes certain products have PCBs below 50 parts per million, and they may be legitimately what we call something that might be excluded from the regulation. Sometimes that's not the case. And then you also have the issue we were talking about earlier about recycling. When you have, say, concrete that has PCBs, say, has 20 parts per million PCBs. To us, that would be a PCB remediation waste that needs to be disposed of, not used. So it would have to be disposed of, say, in a municipal landfill, municipal waste landfill, and an approval from EPA wouldn't be needed to do that disposal. So that's where the notification to EPA comes in, and that's where it's good for these applicants to be aware of the federal requirements that we have for disposal of PCBs, the different PCB different PCB wastes, so that when they're evaluating their buildings, they keep that in mind and do a thorough evaluation of the building, including sampling maybe for concrete beyond where the caulking is, for example.
So that's my follow-up question is, say they do find some PCBs, they contact you, what criteria or guidelines do you use to determine what additional sampling is needed or might be needed in terms of concrete, soil, any other materials? How do you move forward with that at that point?
Well, at that point, it depends. It's more like, what is the situation they have? Let's say they have windows, and those windows, all of them have caulking around the frames, and maybe the substrate is stucco, for example. So we would suggest they propose the samples that they plan to collect to determine what is the impact to that material. Usually, for most of the demolitions we have dealt with, that has been done already. Some people have used like criteria from asbestos sampling and have applied that to PCBs and collected the samples already, have the results. They bring the results to us and say, okay, this is what we have, this is how we're going to dispose of it. We don't get too involved in all those previous steps.
Yeah, but I guess now that we're kind of opening this up, you're going to be dealing with a lot of people who don't have that experience that you're describing, that are used to a certain process and a certain way of even getting to the point where they're in touch with you. So these people don't really know what they should have been doing.
There is, we could refer them to materials that we have in our website. So our website has a lot of information on building materials, how to handle building materials, to sample, different steps to take, even during renovation of buildings and things like that. So there is, I don't know, maybe like 10, 15 different fact sheets in there that provide information, and some of them deal directly with sampling.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure, so I work for the city of Sunny.
We don't have like a sampling criteria that we are applying. We have not developed something like that.
Right, it's case by case, and you talk through the situation with them to determine what additional
they have or
they might need to do.
Yeah, or some of them are very savvy already. They know what to do, how to go about it.
Okay.
Here's one of the EPA websites, and you can see over on the side, it's got disposal notifications and some other fact sheets about PCBs and building materials.
So this applies to what we're calling PCB remediation waste. So it's more for like the concrete, the metal that is impacted by PCBs, for soils, for sediments. So that's what these particular tools do. They don't address the actually manufactured material, the material is manufactured with PCBs, but it addresses the materials that are contaminated by that which is manufactured with PCBs. So this has checklists, it has information on the regulations, how they're applied, and it gives a notification checklist too for someone who wants to notify EPA. They can follow that as well and just apply what is, there is a lot of information in that document, so they can just apply what really pertains to them in that notification.
I'm sorry, but as far as these EPA quote requirements, I think I understood that this is something that contractors should be doing, but that they're not held to test for these yet through EPA. I mean, it's not an absolute requirement. Could you clarify?
Well, EPA doesn't necessarily require that somebody test caulking or test mastic or anything like that necessarily. But this is a demolition situation where somebody's going to create waste. And wastes have to be disposed properly. There are regulations that say this is the provisions that apply to this type of waste, like caulking, where it has to be disposed in the way that is in the regulation and consistent with the state requirements as a hazardous waste. Then there is the other side of the coin where we have PCB waste that are less than 50 parts per million, but they are still subject to disposal under our provisions. And so that disposal needs to be done properly. So all this already exists in the regulations. It's not like we have a regulation for demolition. We don't have that. What we have is, all right, we're going to clean up PCBs, soils, metal, concrete, or other things. So we have disposal requirements. You have these concentrations. This is where you dispose of it. Hazardous waste landfill, recreational landfill, things like that. So it's something people already, if they are somewhat familiar with the EPA regulations for disposal, they know, this building is going to be demolished, and yes, there's going to be waste that is regulated by EPA, but also regulated by the state.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
That helps. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we're going to move on to the next section, then we'll have Q&A at the end as well. So this is the final section of the presentation. It's about the municipal process and enactment, some options. It's a pretty short section, but I wanted to give you some examples of either processes, regulations, permit documents that you might look at, websites. So we're going to go through this, and it should be pretty quick, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So first, just again, the next steps. Determine if you need an ordinance or revise an existing ordinance, and make that determination if you have sufficient legal authority to then go ahead and create or modify your various regulations and permit documents. You want to make sure you're briefing municipal leaders, keep them involved, and of course the main management staff, they're involved, building officials, public works directors, the city manager, town manager, or county executive. Begin revising your applicable permit processes for demolition, building permits, construction demolition requirements, and begin that process to modify your ordinance or other adoption process if needed, if applicable or needed, and working with those staff. And once again, as soon as possible. Here's an example timeline. So if you were to start right away, and let's say if we could actually go backwards and look at, if you're going to adopt an ordinance in, say, May, that's going to be effective on July 1st. And we put May there because you get a first and second reading. You could have some delay in that process, and then usually it takes 30 days to take effect after the second reading. So that's really, the 30 days is really June. So really you need to have that second reading happen in May. You might need, and we've even put some time in March and April for those readings. You might need to, going backwards to February, you might have to have some briefings with management. You might have a study session before it goes for the first and second reading. You need to even, get these materials onto your calendar for the council meeting or board of supervisors. That might happen in January. And developing the supporting materials, the staff reports, even though we've given you a lot of model documents, of course you have to customize them yourself. And then going back to this calendar year, you need to start having that internal process and figuring out what approach you're going to use. So that's kind of a rough timeline to show you how much time it might take. Now, if you go with the management option, it could take a month or two. It could be a lot faster. But if you think you're going to need the ordinance and you need to make that determination first, of course, then you're going to be looking at a longer process. Right, and of course, just warning again, you got to have this in place. Make sure everybody knows that. July 1st, there's really nothing in the permit that allows anybody to do it later. It's got to be done by that time. So you would be getting possibly a notice of violation if you don't have it ready to go on July 1st. Oops. Went ahead there. Okay, so now just a few examples. I took some screenshots. Here's the city of Richmond. They have this page for their demolition permit process. This would be a good place to add something about this program. And if you have a web page, and if you have does anybody here not have a demolition permit process? I think we've heard that most jurisdictions, if not all, have some kind of a permit for a demolition of a building. Some people might I've heard anecdotally that some people might incorporate it into their building permit. But I think that everybody has a separate demolition permit, actual permit. Okay, so nobody here doesn't have that. Everybody requires a demolition permit. Okay, so that's good. So that's obviously one of the key mechanisms is your demolition permit. And here's a page from the city of San Mateo from their municipal code. Once again, this is, as I mentioned earlier, you got up there in the top of the page under A, the discharge of non-stormwater discharges to the city storm drain system is prohibited. All discharges of material other than the stormwater must be in compliance with an NDS and PDS permit. So that's really the key section there that I think most or many people may decide, or some may decide that they already have legal authority to establish this program. And you may not need to modify your existing ordinance. But for due diligence or to publicize it more and make it more explicit, you might want to modify that especially for the public and for property owners. Here's another example from the city of San Mateo, their building demolition plan submittal checklist. So a lot of people may have a checklist of things that they require the building owner or the applicant to check off before they start doing the demolition. And some of these things, obviously paying fees, filling out applications, submitting plans. There could be public safety requirements if they're going to need to close off a street. There could be all kinds of different things that are required. I think I saw also in some of the working with PG&E, making sure that if you're going to demolish a building that there's safety for electrical connections and gas connections, all those kinds of things as well. So those are the regulations that probably everybody has already, and we'd be adding to that section. And it could be something where you say, we now have this additional form that you need to fill out, and you refer to that additional form, or you could incorporate this form that we have into the existing forms that you already have. Here's the Santa Clara County Department of Planning and Development. So they have some information here about demolition of an existing structure as another example of a website. Here's the city of Oakland, and Oakland I chose as one of the examples because they're one of the first jurisdictions to really start aggressively requiring the recycling of construction and demolition debris. And they've, I think, 20 years of now of experience, something like that, of working with contractors. So I wanted to go look and see what they had. This is a section from their municipal code about demolition permits. And they have some definitions that might also need to be adjusted if you know, or for this specific program. We're talking about whole building demolition. So if there's a difference in definitions, they might need to deal with that. Here's another section from their web page on their C&D recycling ordinance requirements. And I think it does say something here about well, some forms they need to be filled out. Also, I chose this one as an example because they use the Green Halo system, which some of you may use for the C&D program. You might want to talk with Green Halo and see what they can do to modify or streamline this through that system. How many people here are familiar with Green Halo? Some? Okay. So it's basically an online kind of third-party version. Instead of having an applicant fill out a bunch of paperwork for the city or the jurisdiction, you can have them use Green Halo instead, and it's a web-based system, and they collect a lot of the data for you, and they can give you data for it, but there's a fee for it. It's a for-profit company, so there's you know, some advantages and disadvantages with that program. And then finally, here's the Oakland's construction demolition debris waste reduction recycling plan format or form. So these might also need to be amended. Here's we were talking about conditions of approval for projects. So when I say conditions of approval, I'm thinking of more of the planning term. Some people, I think, they just think, oh, these are the conditions, you know, or requirements for pulling a permit. So, but if we're thinking about planners, conditions of approval specifically require to an entitlement process or a zoning permit or use permit, and that's what this is from. So if it's a large project and they're coming into the jurisdiction to get entitlements and get approval for not only the building demolition, but what's going to happen afterwards, what they're going to build there later, then they typically will have conditions of approval, and this is from the standard conditions of approval from Emeryville, actually, where I used to work, and so I knew that we had this here. And what I was told is that this number 9, I believe it is here, about lead and asbestos, this is a state-required condition of approval. That every permitting agency is required to have this particular condition of approval related to lead and asbestos cleanup and remediation. That might be a good place to either add to that existing one about PCBs, and you can use language from our model documents for that. Or you could have a separate condition of approval that says, you know, that they will fill out the application form before any demolition takes place or as part of the demolition permitting process. But not every project comes in for entitlements. They might just be doing the demolition separately and only pulling the demolition permit. So that's why you need it in both places. I think you can't just rely on conditions of approval because they may not be coming in for that process, that entitlement process yet. They might just want to demolish the building and then deal with all that later. So it needs to be probably done in both areas. Okay, so that's the end of our presentation, and we have now, I think, about 15 minutes or more if needed for more general Q&A about the whole program. We can try to talk a little more about some of the areas we've already discussed, maybe a little more detail. I wanted to make a statement, and I think John clarified, tell me if I'm wrong in this, but I think basically what we were getting at before, I think what Sherry was getting at is that there's all these existing regulations, and there are many buildings that are going through the proper remediation processes now to deal with PCBs. We often see it for government-owned buildings, or for large, like Candlestick Park, or for Kaiser Hospital. So some people are already doing this, but not everybody is doing it. And I think that was part of the goal here, is to try to get everybody to test, not just kind of the, you know, maybe more responsible parties who, like Kaiser being a health-related organization, they don't want anything to like come out in the press that, oh, we didn't do the right thing, even when maybe it wasn't technically required, but they want to do the right thing. And that's kind of what I think that some of these regulations is geared at, making a more level playing field and making everybody do their due diligence and really following the intent of the regulations. Even maybe it wasn't enforced 100% of the time. Now we're going to require them to test if they have go through these screening, if they go through the screened-in process. That sounds right? Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have three questions here. I think you can answer two of them very shortly. But the first is, if you could define the implementation that's required on July 19th. So does that mean we have to have it in our applications or conditions? That's the way I read it, to begin requiring this, or will projects that are, say, in the process of getting a demo permit be required to mitigate those?
Yeah, so there's kind of that deemed complete.
Correct. Like it's a C3 kind of, it's always tricky with these dates that we have, due dates of which projects apply.
So let's just do one at a time first. So I think the first one, there's got to be a date at which they apply for a building permit, and whether or not you've approved it, you probably would have to have in place, I would think, if it's the program has to be in place by July 1st. So anybody that's coming in to apply, I would think, unless it's earlier, if you decide to do earlier, but the latest possible date would be on July 1st. If someone comes in to apply for a building permit, they've got to now comply with these new regulations. So I would think if they apply on June 30th, and in your jurisdiction it hasn't started yet, they could apply on that date. Now, whether or not you can say we haven't approved it yet, that can vary by jurisdiction. I don't think that's defined in the permit necessarily, but
that's the way I read it, and I'm not as concerned about your example there one day. I'm more concerned about other projects. Okay, so from what the presentation, it doesn't appear that there is a certification required at the completion of the demolition project, so we're not kind of doing that.
Yeah, we discussed that earlier, like a two-step process, and I think given the unknowns with EPA about how long that would take and what's all involved, and now are we trying to certify a review or figure out if they worked correctly with EPA, that was seen as kind of out of the hands of the municipal staff, that we wanted to say, give us this first form, certify it, and do your testing if it's required, and then you deal with EPA from that point on.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. And then the last one is any reporting requirements, project-specific reporting requirements. Do you know if we're going to be required in our annual reports to track and list out these projects, or will it be just claiming that you're doing it and it's available if needed?
Yeah, I don't know if that's fully been fleshed out yet. I would think that we're going to probably have some questions in the annual report, and it'll probably say how many buildings were demolished in your jurisdiction that had to comply either, with this process, either screened in or screened out. It would probably be something as simple as that. Now, there's the other part about submitting data to BASMA, which we still need to work on. What data gets transmitted to them and how it gets packaged to the regional board, but I think there'll be at least that minimum level of information of how many buildings went through the process and got screened out and screened in.
Thank you.
And I guess there'll probably also be a question that said, on what date did your PCBs program begin effective, implementation, on what date? And hopefully it's July 1st or earlier. Yeah.
Questions regarding the who signs the certification? You mentioned property owners, possibly the environmental consultant that actually does the testing.
Right.
I know that a lot of companies use runners. They just come in, apply for the demo.
Right.
So
that won't be allowed, I think, anymore with this, at least with this particular form that they'll have to fill out. it'll have to be the property owner or the legal representative of the property owner, in addition to, if there is a consultant doing it'll have to be both. So at least the legal owner or a representative, and secondly, the consultant if there is one.
Okay, so will the template that's provided have that kind of language in there so that it's clear to?
What you saw on the screen is what's in the package. It says there.
I forgot my glasses.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, these screens are a little small to see some of the smaller. But yes, it does say in there, and it's got a description too of who needs to sign.
I apologize if you have put this up there. I was a little late coming back from break. Where can we find all the materials?
Right.
Is there? I was going to. And also, I mean, you've mentioned them through. I wasn't sure if the link was living on the Basmaa website. And can we also have a copy of this presentation?
Yes. So I think what we'll do is we'll send a follow-up email to everybody who's registered, both for the web version or the live streaming and who attended in person. And I think there were about 90 people that are in that category. And we'll send a PDF of the presentation today. You can also, this will be recorded, the live stream version, so you could go back and watch that. We'll hopefully have a link to that as well at some point. I'm not sure if we'll get that today, that link, but so that it is being recorded, we'll give you the PDF, and we'll have information to a link to the Dropbox or the Basmaa website where we have all the documents as well, right? Both? Is it both? Yeah, there's two places. And we'll have information about the next training. That's October 31st is the next training as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're also distributing all the materials through the countywide stormwater programs.
Right.
So Jim, for example, will get them, and we're asking the program managers to then in turn distribute to all the municipalities in their county. So you'll get things that way as well. Did we answer all of your questions?
Yeah, and
yeah.
Oh, well, and then, yeah, that's right. We would also give the PowerPoint as well, so that people can use the PowerPoint. Right?
Yeah, there's a few different documents that we're going to provide as editable versions. We haven't done that yet, but that's going to happen real soon. Actually, we did send them to the program managers, the applicant form and so forth, so you can edit it and incorporate it into your own municipality's materials.
And we'll provide this as a PowerPoint, not a PDF, so you can see the
and so
speaker notes.
Once again, our cautionary note is, yes, you can modify these applicant package materials, but just make sure that if you take out those screening questions into some other document, that you also take the certification portion with it, because you've got to make sure they certify those yes/no questions, those three screening questions. Yeah, two more, yeah.
So if we get a screening package back and it's an applicable structure and they do have PCBs above the 50 ppm threshold and they've sampled all the right materials, are we then supposed to issue them their demolition permit without us, the cities, needing to see their abatement plan? We're not really supposed to review the abatement.
Right. So I think that was part of the two-step process concept originally was, well, we don't want to issue the demolition permit until we know they've done their due diligence. But then we were like, well, what if there's a delay? So I think we've decided not to do that. That we're basically saying, okay, you've shown us, you're certifying X, Y, and Z, and if they're showing that they have materials above those limits, they're going to have to work with EPA, and we're going to assume that they're going to do that, and that they've legally, stated that they will do that. And so you're going to go ahead and issue the demolition permit, and they will need to go work with EPA and maybe the state as well on what they need to do. Okay. So I don't think we're holding up demolition permits while we, hear from EPA, whatever. We're saying, nope, you need to go do what you need to do, and we've given you all the information about what you need to do, and you're certifying that you're going to do it. Yeah. So I think that's how that works.
Okay, thanks.
Follow up to that question. So we only need to have Section 3. So the contractor or the person applying for the demo, if they fall into that category, they would have to fill out have the screening done before we can issue the permit.
Yeah, that is true. If they're screened in, then they need to submit that additional information. So they can't just submit the form and say, oh yeah, our building's in 1960, but we haven't done any testing yet. So yeah, that's all part of the form that they need to certify that they've done the testing. So they might come in and they might say, oh, here's the form and check, sign, but they haven't done the testing. If they're screened in, then you can't approve it. You have to wait for them to say, okay, no, you need to go do this testing because you're screened in. So you wouldn't be able to approve it then. You'd have to wait till they come back and say yes or no to that. But that's part of the form that they're saying yes or no, we've done the testing if it was required.
And this question I think might be for John, in that the industry stakeholders, I thought there was a comprehensive list. I heard 100 to 150. Is that correct? And where would we find that list? I looked on the...
Well, we did work, there's an Association of Environmental Consultants, Contractors, AEC, I think it was one of there's a couple different industry groups, and we've done some outreach.
I meant for the developers, the actual developer, the stakeholders who've been attending, who we've had communication to.
Yeah, we do have a spreadsheet with that, and we can post it. I don't think we have yet, but we can post that with the other materials.
Yes, I would need that. Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, there was outreach to those various industrial folks.
Yeah, and Sandy Matthews and I went to and did a presentation. Sandy did a presentation to one of those environmental testing and consulting organizations in August. So they're well aware of this. I suppose to a certain extent they're in favor of this regulation because it's going to bring them more business. And so they want, and I think they've been frustrated in the past because they think like, oh, this building's 1960. It's a concrete building. It's probably got PCBs in it. They probably advise their consultants or their clients that they should do the testing, and then the property's like, yeah, am I required to? No, okay, I'm not going to do it. It's like this almost like don't ask, don't tell kind of thing. So now that loophole kind of is going away. Yeah.
So demo permits for our city are primarily over the counter, even for very large projects.
Right.
And so what it seems like what needs to happen is that all this information, the applicant package, everything needs to be up on a website somewhere. And they basically need to go through the package, fill out the form, if they need to do the sampling, remove the materials, be in touch with the EPA and work with them on additional requirements. And all of that needs to be done before they even come to our counter and have that face-to-face contact with us.
No, not necessarily. I think they could.
Because the thing is, from some initial discussions we've had with people, our understanding is that when they get the demo permit, they're going to start knocking things down. And so, you can't. So basically, the removal of the PCB priority materials, if that is pertinent, has to be done before the permit is issued.
True, right. But at the counter, they would have to see that either Part 2 was filled out, that it's exempt, or Part 3, they have gone and done the sampling.
Right. I'm talking about where they do need to do the situation where they
look
do
at
need
some
to
of the
do
materials I showed on there. It talked about asbestos and lead and the process for that. That's all part of the demolition permit process, is that they have to do those things as well. This is adding another one of those similar kind of issues to it. It's another material or possibly hazardous waste issue that they need to deal with. So I think it's very similar to that process. They might not know about these PCB regulations, and they might be finding out about it when they come in to pull the demolition permit. and at which case you will be informing them, oh, we have this new requirement, fill out these forms, and if you do X, Y, and Z, if you're screened in and you're doing the testing, now you're going to need to do this remediation, and you're going to need to work with EPA. So I could see it going both ways. I could see them, some people who are more maybe knowledgeable and have done other demolitions in other locations, they might know in advance that they need to go find a consultant and go through a whole process of removing the offending materials or doing their remediation before they come in to get a building demolition permit or a demolition permit. So I could see it working both ways.
Yeah, so you're saying that the demo permit can be issued prior to all that happening?
Not prior to Section 3 being filled out and certified, but prior to completing any discussions with EPA.
There's also an issue. The word issue is also very particular. My understanding from building permits is that you apply for a permit, you can approve a permit, you can issue a permit, and you can final a permit. And so that's all very specific terminology to a building permit, and I'm not sure exactly which term you're using for the demolition permit. Issuing might be different from approving as opposed to finaling, or, so what my understanding is that, and maybe then John can go, is that they come in, they fill out the forms. If they've certified everything and they've done their testing, because you can't approve the demolition permit when they fill out that form if the testing is required and they haven't done it yet, you can't approve it. So, John, go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure about all the details you just talked about, Peter, but the program overall was deliberately structured so that you don't have to do the abatement before you issue the demo permit. I mean, part of the thinking there is the abatement might happen completely before the demolition, or it might happen concurrent with the demolition to some extent, depending on the circumstances there. So the testing and the certification that the testing was done, that has to be done before the demolition permit is issued, the way we structured the program, but not the abatement. Does that make sense?
Was that the feedback you got from I'm curious about the feedback you got from the industry folks who are actually doing this work. Do they think that's workable, where they have the demo permit in hand and then they'll go ahead and concurrently remove the materials while they're doing the demo? Is that something that is,
I think so. I mean, I don't recall having that specific discussion with industry people. It was more based on feedback we got from municipal people that they wanted it structured that way.
So it seems to me from this conversation, everybody does things a little bit differently, all the cities. From my information gathering, I think talking to your planning department and looping in with their processes is probably the most important part, to get that information out there as early as possible, to let them know that they're going to have to, complete this before, in your case, going to the counter and asking for a demo permit. I wanted to ask you if you guys had put any thought into, because what I was thinking is we could, even at the staff level, screen out some of these projects before they even, when they come in with an application. You talked about having to certify the screening. It may be that we have data, and I'm not sure. I'm going to talk to our planning and building department. Applicant comes in. We know this building was built in 1985, and I've been here long enough that I've actually inspected sites that I inspected which were built when I started here. So there's so much construction going on that's actually going to be the case, where it's post 1980. I don't know if we have any before 1950.
For post, I think that's feasible. For pre, we can't do that because they could have been remodeled, right? So just because the building was built in 1920 doesn't mean you can exempt them from this whole process. But post, obviously, if it was built in and after 1981 or later, January 1st, 1981 or later, you can say, well, there's no way that this particular building would have to comply with these particular regulations.
So if we have a similar setup as Sunnyvale, it's not a over-the-counter all the time, but it is an expedited demo procedure. And so my question is if if there's an application that comes through, it is approved, they come in with their survey results, and it is identified as being positive for PCBs on a Tuesday, and then a week later, I mean, they're supposed to be going through this with EPA, but a week later, we see the building getting torn down. What's the obligation of the city? Who's the enforcement agency for that? How would that work?
I suppose you could report it to EPA. You could report it to the state. So I would go look at that one slide we had, and it's in the package, I believe, all the different regulations that are applicable. And so I think that would be the due diligence on the city or the permitting authority to say it seems unlikely that they would have completed all of their testing and remediation, everything, well, remediation in this case, in a week. But
because we do have to do a final on the demo, the building department has to do a final on it. Oh, go ahead, Carmen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that if somebody goes ahead and demolishes this building, and the building probably had PCBs, I think the part where they're probably at odds with things is in the disposal. So if they don't know what they're disposing or what they're recycling, and their recycling turns into unauthorized disposal of something, then that's where trouble comes. So I think it's, as a rule of thumb, would be good to tell people, you know, there are requirements for disposal of materials that have PCBs and waste that have PCBs, and those requirements are for PCBs above or equal to 50, and even in many, depending on the situation, also less than 50 parts per million.
So I can't, right, and I can't speak for our building official, but I think that if we had knowledge that there was work that was done, there was no remediation, it would be, I think, difficult for the building official or the building department to issue a final, because now we've got knowledge of it. So I don't know, is it a referral to DTSC where we final it and say we've referred it to DTSC or EPA?
I'm not sure what you're talking about, the final and the referral. I don't know what you're getting at.
So if we have an active demolition permit, and usually those don't take all that long. It may be a week or 2 weeks, and then the final is done. The final inspection is done. The permit is closed. But if the city had knowledge, maybe my question is more liability is what I'm getting at, but if the city has knowledge of non-compliance on some level with disposal of materials, I think the question from our building official will be is, can I final it? You know, how does that work?
I don't know about the I don't know about the finalization of some of the process at the city's end or somebody else's or somebody else's end, right? But what I can say is, somebody can tell EPA, we think there could be disposal of these materials in a way that is not appropriate or consistent with your regulations. You may want to check it out or something like that. So it could be in a form of a tip to EPA or
I'd like to suggest also that, you know, Carmen said they might be receiving these notifications of disposal, right? You're going to be receiving...
If the applicant submits a notification to EPA, then EPA will work with them.
Right.
On the disposal.
And you said that you could CC staff, or you could involve. I think part of this is going to be communication between EPA and local agency staff. When they get notification from a building owner, then they reply to that within that number of days. Then they can CC and get that information back to you, so that you also are aware of some of that.
EPA can include you in that CC for that applicant on our response to their notification or whatever other document they have given to EPA for approval.
Let me bring it back a question. Yeah, so before we get to the worrying about EPA part, once they're screened in, the city's still obligated to require stormwater requirements for those 5 materials. So I don't see a problem with the building inspectors finaling for what we already know needs to happen. They can't demo the building without dealing with those 5 products. Is that not correct? Is that my understanding? Once we get into this program and they say that we have one of those 5 products, and we've tested and we show that they're there, the city's on the hook to make sure at least those 5 items are addressed. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a gray area because I'm not sure.
We are not EPA, but we have BMPs. We know that they have to address taking them out. Is that, I guess that's kind of where I'd rather back up to than worrying about what happens when they go out to EPA, the black hole. What are we as cities required to do once they screen in? That's the biggest question. What are we required to show sign off on?
It's like the asbestos, where you're not going out and testing the asbestos remediation either. You're relying on another agency to make sure they're doing it right. I think that's what we're relying on EPA here to make sure that they do it right. So let John make a comment first, and then we'll go to you.
I mean, your question about whether you can finalize the demolition or not, it's a legal question. I don't think we know the answer. What I was going to say is, once the testing's been done and they found PCBs, then they are legally required to follow all regulations. And at that point, there's a lot of federal regulations that they have to follow. So if they don't do that, and you know about that, then referring that to EPA would make a lot of sense. As to what you do with your demolition process, I mean, I think you probably have to talk to your own legal people about that at that point. I don't think we can really answer that question.
All right, Carmen wanted to say something else? Oh, she forgot.
Yeah, sorry about that. So we get the information from applicants, what you call the applicants. We get the information of what they tested. We're not getting a notification to build these materials that are manufactured with PCBs. We're getting a notification to dispose of materials that are impacted by the PCBs. Even soils, sediments in storm drains, and things like that. The regulation that covers the disposal of materials that are already manufactured with PCBs, those are pretty much self-implementing regs because they're purely disposal. So somebody can just go there and say, okay, well, I'm going to send it to Nevada, BD Nevada, US Ecology over there. I'm going to send all this caulking that I have removed from the building.
And that's what you call the bulk waste?
That's what we call...
That's the actual caulk itself.
That's what we call PCB bulk product waste.
Right.
But, in this whole process, we have been calling it source materials or something like that, right?
And those are the materials that are more likely to be hazardous, so they're more likely to have to go to a hazardous waste landfill, as opposed to the remediation waste, which might be under the limit for the hazardous.
PCB remediation waste that is 50 parts per million or higher, say you have concrete close to the caulking material, is 1,000 parts per million. It will go to a hazardous waste landfill or a TSCA-approved landfill. Say you have concrete, again, let's just use that example, less than 50 parts per million, then that would be going to a municipal landfill, or it can go to a hazardous waste landfill, to any of the 4 options that we have under our regulations: hazardous waste, municipal landfill, construction debris landfill, or a TSCA-approved landfill that EPA has permitted.
Right.
So my question is, we have all these scenarios where people have done the right thing. In my jurisdiction, a lot of people have already demoed the building before they even apply for a permit. What happens in these situations? Do they just fill out the form and they're either, I would assume you would not even know if they're opted in because there's no materials to dispose of.
So they were supposed to get a demolition permit, but they didn't.
Correct. Let's say they.
So then you would
they
follow
wanna
your
build-
regular enforcement procedures, I guess, in that case. Like, well, they were supposed to get a demolition permit. You could notify EPA that they were supposed to comply with all of these various regulations, and they didn't. So, I guess there's only so much you can do in that case. But it doesn't seem like you can only do enforcement for what you would have done normally, what they should have gotten a demolition permit.
Okay.
As we know, there's lots of things that require a permit, like a hot water heater. A lot of people don't do that, or insulation, so in some jurisdictions, yeah.
Yeah, I moved because I wasn't sure you were going to give me the mic back.
You asked enough questions already.
I just want to go back to what was stated earlier. So if we have in our database, and we know that building is 1981 or later. Later, yeah. We don't need the whole certification, a second document with certification, because it's already in our database. Do you need that information of what didn't get applied, or just the so we have the building?
I would go ahead and document it anyway. If it's a whole building and it's not single-family residential and it's not wood frame, if it could have been one of the categories, I would go ahead and document it, because we don't know yet what's going to be required in your annual report. I would say any whole building demolition that could have been, in this group of buildings, you should just keep track of those. Yeah, right.
Okay, so just like the number that were 1981 and earlier.
Yeah, right,
okay.
Right.
Thank you.
But I don't think we're going to be asking how many single-family homes were demolished, how many wood frame homes were demolished in the annual report. I think we're going to be asking about the ones that were screened in, is my guess, but we'll see. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, everybody, and you'll be getting a follow-up email from us this week.
Thank you, everybody.